to my reading party, and we're gonna start a brand new chapter today. Not just a regular book chapter, we're starting a new book today. So, previously, the only book we've ever read on this channel is The Hobbit, J.R.R. Tolkien's classic. So, we're gonna follow up on that with The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. Just in case you're new here, I have the entire reading session of The Hobbit on my YouTube channel, so you're welcome to check that out. Also, I have never really seriously read this book, The Fellowship of the Ring, but I am very familiar with the movies. So it's kind of uh, kind of interesting to me just to see the differences between them. And also, I am aware that this book has gone through many different editions, and originally it's not really kind of a trilogy. There's a whole history behind it, and I realized even after the trilogy there is still like a big wide world in the Middle Earth lore. We'll see where we go from here, but for now, I want to just focus on this book, and then we'll go from here, and we'll likely finish the trilogy. But I'm not sure about the rest of it. But that's way later. We're just starting this now. So I noticed this game. This book doesn't exactly start right from the beginning. There's quite a bit of prologue and other prefaces. So we're gonna start with the prologue. There are actually a few things talking about how this book was, why the book is the way it is today. I'm not gonna go read through all that. Maybe in my own time, but not to you because I don't think that's going to be very interesting. This whole prologue thing, I debated whether I should read it, but it looks like it should be part of the book. So that's what I'm going to do. By the way, it's taken me a long time to get to this. I believe finished reading The Hobbit almost like 20 days ago, but I've been meaning to catch up on this. A series of things just happened. Like my previous earphone broke down, so I'm sporting a new one. You may notice. Also, I sprained my ankle 2 weeks ago. It's fully almost. I think 99% fully healed now. Also caught a cold, not COVID. At least I hope not. Yeah, a bunch of stuff happened, so now I'm finally catching up, and about time. I've been meaning to do this for so long now. Feels like forever ago since I read the last chapter of The Hobbit, and that was a doozy. That was really exciting. So I'm ready to dive into this. So here we go. Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring, prologue. So I don't even know if we're gonna reach chapter one today. Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just do the prologue today so I can, it's a good chance to test out the new equipment. We can see how this new mic is fashioning. All right, prologue one. So the prologue has a few sections. This is the first section. It's called "Concerning Hobbits." Okay, concerning Hobbits is also the first part of the movie. So yeah, this book is largely concerned with hobbits. I'm gonna turn the camera just a little bit, so it because I tend to lean forward when I read. By the way, in case you don't know this is the same thing with the Hobbit reading. I'm only reading in digital form, so you're not gonna be able to see me actually have a physical book. I would love a physical book, but they take up a lot of space, and I tend to move every few several years. And if you have any experience of moving, you would know that moving with a lot of books is a total bitch. This book is largely concerned with hobbits, and from its pages, a reader may discover much of their character and a little of their history. Oh yeah, it looks like. First of all, welcome, Kargan. And yeah, it looks like there's going to be a huge amount of exposition, but that's kind of the style of these books. I would say they're, if I'm to be honest, they're not the best for this kind of reading parties. But I've been anxious to read these for myself anyway, so might as well. Further information will also be found in the selection from the Red Book of Westmarch that has already been published under the title of The Hobbit. That story was derived from the earlier chapters of the Red Book, composed by Bilbo himself, the first hobbit to become famous in the world at large, and called by him There and Back Again, since they told of his journey into the East and his return. An adventure which later involved all the hobbits in the great events of that age that are here related. Hmm. Staying in character. We're just gonna pretend that the first novel was written by Bilbo himself. But that was written in third. No, I don't think that works. Looking back at some of the things in that book, I don't think that works. Also, involved all the hobbits in the great events. That's not how the movies depicted it. So something's gotta go differently because in the movies, it only ever involved the four hobbits. None of the others ever participated in that. Many, however, may wish to know more about this remarkable people from the outside, while some may not possess the earlier book. For such readers, a few notes on the more important points are here collected from Hobbit lore, and the first adventure is briefly recalled. All right, this is a bit of information dump slash previously on the Middle Earth. By the way, speaking of Middle Earth, when I was reading the Hobbit, I was kind of talking about how I saw a lot of the similar names in Norse mythology and just general Norse culture. And somebody was kind enough to remind me in the comment section that Tolkien was very much influenced by the Norse culture. And then I dawned on me like, duh, of course it is. It's Middle Earth. That's literally Midgard. It's the same thing, just spoken differently. All right, really dive into hobbits right now. Hobbits are an unobtrusive but very ancient people, more numerous formerly than they are today, for they love peace and quiet and good-tilled earth. Well-ordered and well-formed countryside was their favorite haunt. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than a forge bellows, a watermill, or a hand loom, though they were skillful with tools. The hobbits are dying out. Everybody is dying out, so they're no different. I think the general scenario is this is talking about ages past where magic was more prevalent, where magical creatures, magical species were more more all over the place. That's why we have elves, dwarves, and all that. But even here, I think the idea is that magic is dying out. This is the same as all mythologies. Like in the beginning, there's always this mass concentration of power and magic. Uh, like and then they get dissipated. It's like energy always gets dissipated. This is in line with the science as we know today. Like when you see Norse mythology, it's like Ymir is the first giant, and then he dies. His body becomes this and that. It becomes Midgard, and then the second generation is takes. I think, and then I don't know I don't remember the specifics, but then it becomes Odin and his brothers and sisters, and it's just with every generation their power level gets a little bit weakened, and then they have to go around to do more stuff to regain the power that the ancestors have. I think just in generally speaking, it's magic is dying until as we live today. There's like zero magic in the air. Kind of sad. They do not and did not understand or oh, I've already got this. Even in ancient days, they were, as a rule, shy of the big folk, as they call us, and now they avoid us with dismay and are becoming hard to find. They are quick of hearing and sharp eyed, and though they are inclined to be fat and do not hurry unnecessarily, they are nonetheless nimble and deft in their movements. They possessed from the first the art of disappearing swiftly and silently, when large folk whom they do not wish to meet come blundering by. And this art they have developed until to men it may seem magical. But hobbits have never, in fact, studied magic of any kind, and their elusiveness is due solely to a professional skill that heredity and practice and a close friendship with the earth have rendered inimitable by bigger and clumsier races. So there you have it. Maybe there are still hobbits around. It's possible that it's leaving that open. There may still be hobbits living among us. It's just they're so daft and quick, and they don't want to bother with us because we're big, stupid, clumsy people. So that's why we don't know they're here. For they are a little people, smaller than dwarves, less stout and stocky, that is, even when they are not actually much shorter. Their height is variable, ranging between 2 and 4 feet of our measure. They seldom now reach 3 feet, but they have dwindled, they say. In the ancient days they were taller. According to the Red Book, Bandobras Took, or Bull Roarer, son of Isombras III, was 4 foot 5 and able to ride a horse. He was surpassed in all Hobbit records only by two famous characters of old, but that curious matter is dealt with in this book. I think we know who they are. As for the hobbits of the Shire with whom these tales are concerned, in the days of their peace and prosperity they were a merry folk. They dressed in bright colors, being notably fond of yellow and green, but they seldom wore shoes, since their feet had tough leathery soles and were clad in a thick curling hair, much like the hair of their heads, which was commonly brown. Thus the only craft they little practiced among them was shoemaking, but they had long and skilful fingers and could make many other useful and comely things. Their faces were as a rule good-natured rather than beautiful, broad, bright-eyed, red-cheeked, with mouths apt to laughter, and to eating and drinking. I think I would make a pretty good hobbit. And laugh they did, and eat and drink often and heartily, being fond of simple jest at all times, and of 6 meals a day when they could get them. They were hospitable and delighted in parties, and in presents which they gave away freely and eagerly accepted. It is plain, indeed, that in spite of later estrangement, hobbits are relatives of ours, far nearer to us than elves or even the dwarves. Of old they spoke the languages of men, after their own fashion, liked and disliked much the same things as men did. But what exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered. The beginning of hobbits lies far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. Only the elves still preserve any records of that vanished time, and their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men appear seldom and hobbits are not mentioned at all. Yet it is clear the hobbits had in fact lived quietly in Middle-earth for many long years before other folk became even aware of them, and the world being, after all, full of strange creatures beyond count, these little people seemed of very little importance. But in the days of Bilbo and of Frodo, his heir, they suddenly became, by no wish of their own, both important and renowned, and troubled the councils of the wise and the great. First name drop of Frodo, ever. Those days, the third age of Middle-earth, are now long past, and the shape of all lands has been changed. But the regions in which hobbits then lived were doubtless the same as those in which they still linger. The northwest of the Old World, east of the sea. Of their original home, the hobbits in Bilbo's time preserved no knowledge. A love of learning, other than genealogical lore, was far from general among them, but there remained still a few in the older families who studied their own books, and even gathered reports of old times and the distant lands from elves, dwarves, and men. Their own records began only after the settlement of the Shire, and their most ancient legends hardly looked further back than their wandering days. It is clear nonetheless from these legends and from the evidence of their peculiar words and customs that, like many of other folk, hobbits had in the distant past moved westward. Their earliest tale seems to glimpse a time when they dwelt in the upper vales of Anduin, between the eaves of Greenwood the Great and the Misty Mountains. Why they later undertook the hard and perilous crossing of the mountains into Eriador is no longer certain. Their own accounts speak of the multiplying of men in the land, and of a shadow that fell on the forest, so that it became darkened, and its new name was Mirkwood. Oh, Mirkwood. Mirkwood was a long trip. Like, not only long in the story, it was long just reading it. Before the crossing of the mountains, the hobbits had already become divided into three somewhat different breeds: Harfoots, Stoors, and Fallowhides. The Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and the hillsides. The Stoors were broader, heavier in build, their feet and hands were larger, and they preferred the flat lands and the riversides. The Fallowhides were fairer of skin and also of hair, and they were taller and slimmer than the others. They were lovers of trees and woodlands. No, I don't think Bilbo and Frodo are the Fallowhides. The Farfoots had much to do with dwarves in ancient times, and long lived in the foothills of the mountains. They moved westward early and roamed over Eriador. Actually, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. And roamed over Eriador as far as Weathertop, while the others were still in Wildland. They were the most normal and the representative variety of hobbit, and far the most numerous. They were the most inclined to settle in one place, and the longest preserved their ancestral habit of living in tunnels and holes. The Stoors lingered long by the banks of the great river Anduin, and were less shy of men. They came west after the Harfoots, and followed the course of the Loud Water southwards, and there many of them long dwelt between Tharbad and the borders of Dunland before they moved north again. The Fallowhides, the least numerous, were a northerly branch. They were more friendly with elves than the other hobbits were, and had more skill in language and song than in handicrafts, and of all they preferred hunting to tilling. They crossed the mountains north of Rivendell and came down the river Horwell. In Eriador they soon mingled with the other kinds that had preceded them, but being somewhat bolder and more adventurous, they were often found as leaders or chieftains among clans of Harfoots or Stoors. Even in Bilbo's time, the strong Fallow-Hadish strain could still be noted among the greater families, such as the Tooks and the Masters of Buckland. Also, yeah, Bilbo is definitely part Fallowhide because he has Took blood in him. That's where he usually credits his more adventurous side. In the westlands of Eriador, between the misty mountains and the mountains of Lune, the hobbits found both men and elves. Indeed, a remnant still dwelt there on the Dunedain, the kings of men that came over the sea out of Westernness. But they were dwindling fast, and the lands of the North Kingdom were falling far and wide into waste. There was room and to spare for there was room and to spare for incomers, and ere long the hobbits began to settle in ordered communities. Most of their earlier settlement had long disappeared and been forgotten in Bilbo's time, but one of the first to become important still endured, though reduced in size. This was at Bree, and in the Chetwood that lay round about, some 40 miles east of the Shire. Bree, so that's probably something we're gonna be able to see. It was in these early days, doubtless, that the hobbits learned their letters and began to write, after the manner of the Dunedain, who had in their turn, long before learned the art from the elves. And in those days also they forgot whatever languages they had used before, and spoke ever after the common speech, the Westron, as it was named, that was current through all the lands of the kings, from Arnor to Gondor, and about all the coasts of the sea, from Belfalas to Lune. Also known as English. Yet they kept a few words of their own, as well as their own names of months and days, and the great store of personal names out of the past. About this time, legend among the hobbits first becomes history with a reckoning of years, for it was in the 1601st year of the Third Age that the Fallowhide brothers Marcho and Blanco set out from Bree, and having obtained permission from the High King at Fornost, they crossed the brown river Barandun with a great following of hobbits. They passed over the bridge of stone balls that had been built in the days of the power of the North Kingdom, and they took all the land beyond to dwell in, between the river and the far downs. All that was demanded of them was that they should keep the great bridge in repair, and all other bridges and roads, speed the king's messengers, and acknowledge his lordship. Thus began the Shire reckoning. For the year of the crossing of the Brandywine, as the Hobbits turned the name, became year one of the Shire, and all later dates were reckoned from it. Awesome! This is pretty dope history, actually. Fake history, but dope nonetheless. At once, the Western Hobbits fell in love with their new land, and they remained there. and soon passed once more out of the history of men and of elves. While there was still a king, they were in name his subjects, but they were in fact ruled by their own chieftains and meddled not at all with events in the world outside. To the last battle at the foremost with the Witch Lord of Angmar, to the last battle at the foremost with the Witch Lord of Angmar, they sent some bowmen to the aid of the king, or so they maintained, though no tales of men recorded. They probably were too sneaky, so the men never realized they sent any reinforcements. That's probably what happened. So the so I guess theoretically, hypothetically only, and not at all practically, any hobbit could have served as the burglar in Thorin's company. When you really think about it, it's not Bilbo's not like extra sneaky. He's not any more of a burglar material than any other hobbits. But I guess what really set Bilbo apart from the others is really his good heart, his adventurous side. He's just being more cleverer than he knows of himself. So no, in that regard, they can't just pluck any other random hobbit and do the same things. Let's see, Shire Reckoning, name drop for a Witch Lord of Angmar. Sounds pretty important. But in that war, the North Kingdom ended, and then the hobbits took the land for their own, and they chose from their own chiefs a Thane to hold the authority of the king that was gone. There for 1,000 years they were little troubled by wars, and they prospered and multiplied after the Dark Plague, until the disaster of the long winter and the famine that followed it. Many thousands then perished, but the days of dearth were at the time of this tale long past, and the hobbits had again become accustomed to plenty. The land was rich and kindly, and though it had long been deserted when they entered it, it had before been well tilled. And there the king had once had many farms, cornlands, vineyards, and woods. 40 leagues it stretched from the far downs to the Brandywine Bridge, and 50 from the northern moors to the marshes in the south. The hobbits named it the Shire, as the region of the authority of their thane, and a district of well-ordered business. And there in that pleasant corner of the world they plied their well-ordered business of living, and they heeded less and less the world outside, where dark things moved, until they came to think that peace and plenty were the rule in Middle-earth, and the right of all sensible folk. They forgot or ignored what little they had ever known of the Guardians, and of the labors of those that made possible the long peace of the Shire. They were in fact sheltered, but they had ceased to remember it. At no time had hobbits of any kind been warlike, and they had never fought among themselves. In olden days they had of course been often obliged to fight to maintain themselves in a hard world, but in Bilbo's time that was very ancient history. The last battle before the story opens, and indeed the only one that had ever been fought within the borders of the Shire, was beyond living memory. The Battle of Greenfields, SR 1147, uh, SR's Shire Reckoning, in which Bandobras took routed an invasion of orcs. Oh, this may be the first time we actually hear the name orc. You know what I really love about this chapter, the writing, is that this is just assuming we all kind of know this shit. And of course we don't. This is the first time he's talked about any of this shit, but he's writing this as if it's known history. It's like if I'm writing, if I'm talking about America's history and I can just reference Washington without having to explain who Washington is and what he did. It's like that. It's like he's expecting us to know of these famous events, the dark plague, like saying that it's like we're talking about World War II or something. But no, what is that? It, I mean, it doesn't prohibit us from understanding the important story, but it just feels like it's completing the world so much. Where were we? Every time I stop and offer some commentaries, I end up losing where I was. Even the weathers had grown milder, and the wolves that had once come ravening out of the north in bitter white winters were now only a grandfather's tale. So, though there was still some store of weapons in the Shire, These were used mostly as trophies, hanging above hearths or on walls, or gathered into the museum at Michael Delving? The Matham House, it was called, for anything the hobbits had no immediate use for, but were unwilling to throw away. They called a Matham. Oh, so hoarders. Gamers should be able to relate to this very well. Playing Cyberpunk 2077 lately, and oh my god, just the amount of shit I have picked up. The dwellings were apt to become rather crowded with Mathams, and many of the presents that passed from hand to hand were of the sort. Nonetheless, ease and peace had left these people still curiously tough. They were, if it came to it, difficult to daunt or kill. And they were perhaps so unwearingly fond of good things, not least because they could, when put to it, do without them, and could survive rough handling by grief, foe, or weather in the way that astonished those who did not know them well, and looked no further than their bellies and their well-fed faces. Though slow to quarrel, and for sport killing nothing that lived, they were doughty at bay, and at need could still handle arms. They shot well with the bow, for they were keen-eyed and sure at the mark. Not only with bows and arrows, if any hobbit stooped for a stone, it was well to get quickly under cover, as all trespassing beasts knew very well. Oh yeah, still they throw rocks really well. I remember playing a Fellowship of the Ring video game like a long time ago. It was a PC game. Wasn't all that good, but for the longest time I remember the only thing I could do is running around with Frodo, and the only weapon I had was rocks, and there was this whole chunk of puzzle solving section, and it was all about just throwing the rocks at things. All hobbits had originally lived in holes in the ground, or so they believed, and in such dwellings they still felt most at home. But in the course of time they had been obliged to adopt other forms of abode. Actually, in the Shire in Bilbo's days, it was, as a rule, only the richest and the poorest hobbits that maintained the old custom. The poorest went on living in burrows of the most primitive kind, mere holes indeed, with only one window or none, while the well-to-do still constructed more luxurious versions of the simple diggings of old. But suitable sites for these large and ramifying tunnels, or smiles as they called them, were not everywhere to be found, and in the flats and the low-lying districts the hobbits, as they multiplied, began to build above ground. Indeed, even in the hilly regions and the older regions, such as Hobbiton or Talkborough, or in the chief township of the Shire, Michael Delving of the White Downs, there were now many houses of wood, brick, or stone. They were especially favored by millers, smiths, ropers, and cartwrights, and others of that sort, for even when they had holes to live in, hobbits had long been accustomed to build sheds and workshops. The habit of building farmhouses and barns was said to have begun among the inhabitants of the Marish Down by the Brandywine. The hobbits of that quarter, the East Farthing, were rather large and heavy-legged, and they wore dwarf boots in muddy weather. But they were well known to be stewards in a large part of their blood, as indeed was shown by the down that many grew on their chins. The down? You mean the beard? No Harfoot or Fallowhide had any trace of a beard. Okay, they were talking about beard. Indeed, the folk of the Marish and of Buckland east of the river, which they afterwards occupied, came for the most part later into the Shire, up from south away, and they still had many peculiar names to strange words not found elsewhere in the Shire. It is probable that the craft of building, as many other crafts beside, was derived from the Dunedain, but the hobbits may have learned it direct from the elves, the teachers of men in their youth. For the elves of the High Kindred had not yet forsaken Middle-earth, and they dwelt still at the time at the Grey Havens, away to the west, and the other places within reach of the Shire. Three elf towers of immemorial age were still to be seen on the tower hills beyond the western marches. They shone far off in the moonlight. The tallest was furthest away, standing alone upon a green mound. The hobbits of the West Farthing said that one could see the sea from the top of the tower, but no hobbit had ever been known to climb it. Indeed, few hobbits had ever seen or sailed upon the sea, and the fewer still had ever returned to report it. Most hobbits regarded even rivers and small boats with deep misgivings, and not many of them could swim. And as the days of the Shire lengthened, they spoke less and less with the elves and grew afraid of them, and distrustful of those that had dealings with them. And the sea became a word of fear among them, and a token of death, and they turned their faces away from the hills in the west. The craft of building may have come from the craft of building may have come from elves or men, but the hobbits used it in their own fashion. They did not go in for towers. Their houses were usually long, low, and comfortable. The oldest kind were indeed no more than built imitations of smiles, thatched with dry grass or straw, or roofed with turfs, and having walls somewhat bulged. That stage, however, belonged to the early days of the Shire, and hobbit building had long since been altered, improved by devices learned from dwarves or discovered by themselves. A preference for round windows and even round doors was the chief remaining peculiarity of Hobbit architecture. The houses and the halls of Shire hobbits were often large and inhabited by large families. Bilbo and Frodo Baggins were as bachelors very exceptional, as they were also in many other ways, such as their friendship with the elves. Sometimes, as in the case of the Tooks of Great Smiles or the Brandybucks of Brandy Hall, many generations of relatives lived in comparative peace together in one ancestral and many-tunneled mansion. All hobbits were, in any case, clannish and reckoned up their relationships with great care. They drew long and elaborate family trees with innumerable branches. In dealing with hobbits, it is important to remember who is related to them, who is related to whom, and in what degree. It would be impossible in this book to set out a family tree that included even the more important members of the more important families at the time which these tales tell of. The genealogical trees at the end of the Red Book of Westmarch are a small book in themselves, and all but hobbits would find them exceedingly dull. Hobbits delighted in such things, if they were accurate. They like to have books filled with things that they already know, set out fair and square with no contradictions. Uh, wow, that was part one of the prologue, and the part I'm gonna have to drink some water just to moisture my throat a little bit. The second part of the prologue is called "Concerning Pipeweed." So yeah, we're gonna spend some time actually talking about weed, and also I totally understand if any of you consider this just dull or just boring. So I guess it's okay to. I'm just going to do the prologue today. So I'm starting the next time when we come back, I officially start the book. So maybe if this none of this is interesting to you, maybe just start with the next chapter. You have my permission. But it's not that bad to actually read it. I just don't imagine this to be that interesting listening to it. It's actually when I listen to other people like read things, I prefer book stories with more dialogue, with more interaction, and this is kind of just pure exposition. It's not that bad to read for me, but I heavily suspect it's not that fun for you. Sorry, that was what I was just drank. Probably not the best idea. But it's the only thing I got within reach, so what the hell. Concerning pipeweed, there is another astonishing thing about hobbits of old that must be mentioned, an astonishing habit. They imbibed or inhaled, through pipes of clay or wood, the smoke of the burning leaves of a herb, which they called pipeweed or leaf, a variety probably of nicotiana. I don't know what that is. A great deal of mystery surrounds the origin of this peculiar custom, or art, as the hobbits prefer to call it. All that could be discovered about it in antiquity was put together by Meriadoc Brandybuck, later Master of Buckland. Is that Mary? And since he and the tobacco of the South Farthing play a part in the history that follows, his remarks in the introduction to his Herblore of the Shire may be quoted. It is Mary. He wrote a book about weed. Of course he did. Of course Mary would write that. This, he says, oh, I actually have dialogue, is the one art that we can certainly claim to be our own invention. When hobbits first began to smoke is When hobbits first began to smoke is not known. All the legends and family histories take it for granted. For ages, folk in the Shire smoked various herbs, some fouler, some sweeter, but all accounts agree that Tobald Hornblower of Longbottom in the South Farthing first grew the true pipeweed in his gardens in the days of Isengrim the Second, about the year 1070 of Shire reckoning. The best homegrown still comes from that district, especially the varieties now known as Longbottom Leaf, Old Toby, and the Southern Star. How Old Toby came by the plant is not recorded, for to his dying day he would not tell. He knew much about herbs, but he was no traveller. It is said that in his youth he went often to Bree, though he certainly never went further from the Shire than that. It is thus quite possible that he learned of this plant in Bree, where now, at any rate, it grows well on the south slopes of the hill. The Bree hobbits claim to have been the first actual smokers of the pipeweed. They claim, of course, to have done everything before the people of the Shire, whom they refer to as colonists. But in this case, the claim is, I think, likely to be true. And certainly it was from Bree that the art of smoking the genuine weed spread in the recent centuries among dwarves and such other folk, rangers, wizards, and wanderers, are still passed to and fro through that ancient road meeting. The home and the center of the art is thus to be found in the old inn of Bree, the prancing pony, that has been kept by the family of Butterbur from time beyond record. I had no idea this much history about the bar, the the inn, to be precise. All the same, observations that I have made on my own many journeys south have convinced me that the weed itself is not native to all parts of the world, but came northward from the lower Anduin, whither it was, I suspect, originally brought over sea by the men of Westerness. It grows abundantly in Gondor, and there is richer and larger than in the north, where it is never found wild, and flourishes only in warm sheltered places like Longbottom. The men of Gondor call it sweet Galenus, and esteem it only for the fragrance of its flowers. From that land it must have been carried up the Greenway during the long centuries between the coming of Elendil and our own days. But even the Dunedain of Gondor allow us this credit. Hobbits first put it into pipes. Not even the wizards first thought of that before we did. The one wizard that I knew took up the art long ago, and became as skillful in it as in all the other things that he puts his mind to. Let's have a guess who that particular wizard is. So that was relatively a short section. We're going to the third part of the prologue. It's called "Of the Ordering of the Shire." The ordering. What does that refer to? The Shire was divided into four quarters, the farthings already referred to, north, south, east, and west, and these again each into a number of folklands which still bore the names of some of the old leading families, although by the time of this history these names were no longer found only in their proper folklands. Nearly all Tooks still lived in the Tookland, but that was not true of many other families, such as the Bagginses or the Boffins. Outside the Farthings were the East and West Marches, the Buckland, and the West March added to the Shire in SR, which is Shire Reckoning, 1452. The Shire at this time had hardly any government. Families, for the most part, managed their own affairs. Growing food and eating it occupied most of their time. In other matters, they were, as a rule, generous and not greedy, but contented and moderate, so that estates, farms, workshops, and the small trades tended to remain unchanged for generations. There remained, of course, the ancient tradition concerning the High King at Fornost, or Norbury as they call it, away north of the Shire, but there had been no king for nearly 1,000 years, and even the ruins of King's Norbury were covered with grass. Yet the hobbits still said of wild folk and wicked things such as trolls that they had not heard of the king. For they attributed to the king of old all their essential laws, and usually they kept the laws of free will, because they were the rules, as they said, both ancient and just. It is true that the Took family had long been preeminent, for the office of Thane had passed to them from the old Bucks some centuries before, and the Chief Took had borne that title ever since. The Thane was the master of the Shire Moot, and the captain of the Shire Master and the Hobbitry in arms. But as Master and the Moot were only held in times of emergency, which no longer occurred, the Thaneship had ceased to be more than a nominal dignity. The Took family was still indeed accorded a special respect, for they remained both numerous and exceedingly wealthy, and was liable to produce in every generation strong characters of peculiar habits and even adventurous temperament. The latter qualities, however, were now rather tolerated in the rich than generally approved. The custom endured nonetheless of referring to the head of the family as the Took, and of adding to his name if required a number, such as Isengrim II, for instance. The only real official in the Shire at this date was the mayor of Michael Delve. I gotta find out how to pronounce that. It's spelled Michel pronunciation. Let's see. It's Michel. But that's in Dutch, German, French. What's it in English? See if I can find this. It's all about it's all they're all about pronouncing them in different languages. So I don't know. Maybe we should try Finnish since it comes from Norse. So yeah, I don't know. I have no idea. This has appeared several times. So I'm just gonna call it Michael. I don't know. I don't care. The mayor of Michael Delving, or of the Shire, who was elected every 7 years at the free fair on the White Downs at the Life, that is at midsummer. And if you know the how I should be pronouncing this in the context of the Lord of the Rings, please let me know in the comments or in live chat if you're here right now. To be honestly, I expect to face quite a few of these problems. If some of these names aren't mentioned by the movies, I probably would struggle to pronouncing them. I mean, if the Harry Potter movies didn't happen, I probably would probably still don't know how to pronounce Hermione. As mayor, almost his only duty was to preside at the banquets given on the Shire holidays, which occurred at frequent intervals. But the offices of postmaster and the first sheriff were attached to the mayoralty, so that he managed both the messenger service and the watch. These were the only Shire services, and the messengers were the most numerous, and much the busier of the two. By no means all hobbits were lettered, but those who were wrote constantly to all their friends, and a selection of their relations who lived further off than an afternoon's walk. The sheriffs was the name that the hobbits gave to their police, or the nearest equivalent that they possessed. They had, of course, no uniform, such things being quite unknown, only a feather in their caps, and they were in practice rather haywards than policemen, more concerned with the strayings of beasts than of people. They were in all the Shire, only 12 of them, three in each farthing, for inside work. A rather larger body varying a need was employed to beat the bounds and to see that outsiders of any kind, great or small, did not make themselves a nuisance. At the time when the story begins, the bounders, as they were called, had been greatly increased. There were many reports and complaints of strange persons and creatures prowling about the borders, or over them. The first sign that all was not quite as it should be, and always had been except in tales and legends of long ago. Few heeded the sign, and not even Bilbo had yet had any notion of what it portended. 60 years had passed since he set out on his memorable journey, and he was old even for hobbits, who reached 100 as often as not. But much evidently still remained of the considerable wealth that he had brought back. How much or how little he revealed to no one. Hey, thanks for following, Kargan. Welcome to the party, formally. But so 60 years has passed. He was old even for hobbits who reached 100 as often as not, but much evidently still remained of the considerable wealth that he had brought back. How much or how little he revealed to no one, not even to Frodo, his favorite nephew. For some reason, nephew is quoted. Is Frodo not his actual nephew? and it still kept a secret the ring that he had found. Ooh, I don't know. Is that going to be important? So, is Frodo not his actual nephew? Maybe he's not like the nephew as in the child of your sibling, because I don't think Bilbo has any siblings. So yeah, he wouldn't actually have nephews, I guess, and he's not married. So the way nephew is probably just means he's a relative that at the proper age of as you usually would expect a nephew to be at, and he's close to him. So I don't know. Just if he's not your real nephew, adopt him as a son. Have you ever heard anyone say, anybody say to a child like, "Hey, I love you like I love you like a nephew," like instead of a son, like you're like a nephew to me. Like what the hell does that even mean, man? So 60 years since the Hobbit. He's 100 and in the movie he's 111th. That means he was what 51 when he completed the journey, and he's still keeping the ring. Of course he is. And the fourth part of the prologue is called "Of the Finding of the Ring." Now this should be interesting. As is told in The Hobbit, there came one day to Bilbo's door the great wizard, Gandalf the Grey, and the 13 dwarves with him. None other indeed than Thorin Oakenshield, descendant of kings, and his 12 companions in exile. With them he set out, to his own lasting astonishment, on the morning of April, it being then the year 1341 Shire reckoning, on a quest of great treasure, the dwarf hordes of the kings under the mountain, beneath Erebor Dale, far off in the east. The quest was successful, and the dragon that guarded the horde was destroyed. Yet though before all was won, the battle of 5 armies was fought, and the Thorin was slain, and many deeds of renown were done, the matter would scarcely have concerned later history, or even more or earned more than a note in the long annals of the Third Age. But for an accident, by the way, but for an accident, by the way, s- I will read that kind of weirdly. It wouldn't have been more than a note in history, but for an accident on the way. Accident, I guess, means Bilbo getting the ring. The party was assailed by orcs in the high pass of the Misty Mountains as they went towards Wildland, and so it happened that Bilbo was lost for a while in the black orc mines deep under the mountains. And there, as he groped in vain in the dark, he put his hand on a ring lying on the floor of a tunnel. He put it in his pocket. It seemed then like mere luck. No, it was the Force. That's what it is. We're connecting the universe now. Also interesting is that he's saying those were orcs instead of goblins because they were definitely goblins in the Hobbits. I remember a previous chat telling me that Tolkien considered the orcs and the goblins the same thing. I forgot if that was a check or a YouTube comment, but yeah, it certainly seems like that's the case. He's not making the difference between them. They didn't. He didn't mention orc at all in the Hobbits. It was always goblin, and now he's saying those were orcs. So according to him, they're the same thing, but according to the movies, they are slightly different. I think goblin was more of a natural thing, and orc is more manufactured. At least that's how the movie seemed. Trying to find his way out, Bilbo went on down to the roots of the mountains until he could go no further. At the bottom of the tunnel lay a cold lake far from the light, and on an island of rock in the water lived Golem. He was a loathsome little creature. He paddled a small boat with his large, flat feet, peering with pale, luminous eyes and catching blind fish with his long fingers and eating them raw. He ate any living thing, even orc, if he could catch it and strangle it without a struggle. He possessed a secret treasure that had come to him long ages ago, when he still lived in the light, a ring of gold that made its wearer invisible. It was the one thing he loved, his precious, and he talked to it, even when it was not with him. for he kept it hidden safe in a hole on his island, except when he was hunting or spying on the orcs of the mines. Maybe he would have attacked Bilbo at once if the ring had been on him when they met, but it was not. And the hobbit held in his hand an elvish knife, which served him as a sword. So to gain time, Gollum challenged Bilbo to the riddle game, saying that if he asked a riddle which Bilbo could not guess, then he would kill him and eat him. But if Bilbo defeated him, then he would do as Bilbo wished. He would lead him to a way out of the tunnels. Which is a game that if I were in Bilbo's shoes, I would certainly lose, because I'm not good at puzzles. Also, I tend not to be able to remember them if I'm just hearing them. Since he was lost in the dark without hope and could neither go on nor back, Bilbo accepted the challenge, and they asked one another many riddles. In the end, Bilbo won the game more by luck, as it seemed, than by wits, for he was stumped at last for a riddle to ask, and cried out, as his hand came upon the ring he had picked up and forgotten, "What have I got in my pocket?" This Gollum failed to answer, though he demanded three guesses. The authorities, it is true, differ whether this last question was a mere question and not a riddle according to the strict rules of the game, but all agree that, after accepting it and then trying to guess the answer, Gollum was bound by his promise. Is Tolkien trying to cover his own base here? Is this. Were there any, controversies after The Hobbit was published? I don't think so. I don't think The Hobbit was actually published. I don't know. Were there any people, readers, actually, I don't know, write to him and say that Bilbo's cheating? That's not a riddle. And is he actually responding to that? Because it would be interesting if that is. He's like, shut up about it. Just Gollum agreed, so all bets are off. The rules don't matter anymore. If you agree to an unfair rule, you still gotta abide by it. And Bilbo pressed him to keep his word, for the thought came to him that this slimy creature might prove false, even though such promises were held secret, and of old, all but the wickedest things feared to break them. But after ages alone in the dark, Gollum's heart was black, and the treachery was in it. He slipped away and returned to his island, of which Bilbo knew nothing, not far off in the dark water. There, he thought, lay his ring. He was hungry now, and angry, and once his precious was with him, he would not fear any weapon at all. But the ring was not on the island. He had lost it. It was gone. His screech sent a shiver down Bilbo's back, though he did not yet understand what had happened. But Gollum had at last leapt to a guess. Too late. Too late. "What has he got in his pockets?" he cried. Oh my god. I'm gonna Gollum's gonna kill me during this trilogy, I'm sure of it. The light in his eyes was like a green flame as he sped back to murder the hobbit and recover his precious. Just in time, Bilbo saw his peril, and he fled blindly up the passage away from the water, and once more he was saved by his luck. For as he ran, he put his hand in his pocket, and the ring slipped quietly onto his finger. So it was that Gollum passed him without seeing him, and went to guard the way out, lest the thief should escape. Warily Bilbo followed him as he went along, cursing and talking to himself about his precious, from which talk at last even Bilbo guessed the truth, and hope came to him in the darkness. He himself had found the marvelous ring and the chance of escape from the orcs and from Golem. At length they came to a halt before an unseen opening that led to the lower gates of the mines, on the eastward side of the mountains. There Gollum crouched at bay, smelling and listening, and Bilbo was tempted to slay him with his sword. But pity stayed him, and though he kept the ring in which his only hope lay, he would not use it to help him kill the wretched creature at a disadvantage. In the end, gathering his courage, he leapt over Gollum in the dark and fled away down the passage, pursued by his enemy's cries of hate and despair. "Thief! Thief! Baggins! We hate him forever!" Oh, dude, this is not working. Now, it is a curious fact that this is not the story as Bilbo first told it to his companions. To them, his account was that Gollum had promised to give him a present if he won the game. But when Gollum went to fetch it from his island, he found the treasure was gone. a magic ring which had been given to him long ago on his birthday. Bilbo guessed that this was the very ring that he had found, and as he had won the game, it was already his by right. But being in a tight place, he said nothing about it and made Gollum show him the way out as a reward instead of a present. This account Bilbo set down in his memoirs, and he seems never to have altered it himself, not even after the Council of Elrond. Evidently, it still appeared in the original Red Book, as it did in several of the copies and abstracts, but many copies contain the true account, as an alternative, derived no doubt from notes by Frodo or Samwise, both of whom learned the truth, though they seem to have been unwilling to delete anything actually written by the old Hobbit himself. He's still trying to pretend like Bilbo actually wrote the Hobbit, and the inconsistency is only because Frodo or Sam made modifications to it. Is that what we're trying to do here? Okay, I'm game. I won't break the immersion if you don't. Gandalf, however, disbelieved Bilbo's first story as soon as he heard it, and he continued to be very curious about the ring. Eventually, he got the true tale out of Bilbo after much questioning, which for a while strained their friendship, but the wizard seemed to think the truth important. Though he did not say so to Bilbo, he also thought it important and disturbing to find that the good hobbit had not told the truth from the first. Quite contrary to his habit, the idea of a present was not a mere hobbit-like invention, all the same. It was suggested to Bilbo, as he confessed, by Gollum's talk that he overheard, for Gollum did in fact call the ring his birthday present many times. That also Gandalf thought strange and suspicious, but it did not discover the truth in this point for many more years, as will be seen in this book. Of Bilbo's later adventures, little more need be said here. With the help of the ring, he escaped from the orc guards at the gate and rejoined his companions. He used the ring many times on his quest, chiefly for the help of his friends, but he kept his secret from them as long as he could. After his return to his home, he never spoke of it again to anyone, save Gandalf and Frodo, and no one else in the Shire knew of its existence, or so he believed. Only to Frodo did he show the account of his journey and that he was writing. So, when I was reading The Hobbit, I got the impression that the people actually knew that he had a ring, and at least they knew that it could make him invisible. I do remember a few instances where I felt like public knowledge, like he wasn't trying to hide it, but whatever. His sword, Sting, Bilbo hung over his fireplace, and his coat of marvelous mail, the gift of the dwarves from the Dragon Hoard, he lent to a museum. To the Michael Delving Matham house, in fact. Oh no, really? Don't did he? How did he get it back? But he kept in it a drawer. But he kept in a drawer at the back end the old cloak and hood that he had worn on his travels, and the ring, secured by a fine chain, remained in his pocket. He returned to his home at Bag End on June the 22nd of in his 52nd year, and nothing very notable occurred in the Shire until Mr. Baggins began the preparations for the celebration of his 111th birthday. At this point, this history begins. So, okay, the next part does not have a number. It's called a Note on the Shire Records. I suspect this is the last part of the prologue. So we'll see. At the end of the Third Age, the part played by the Hobbits in the great events that led to the inclusion of the Shire in the reunited kingdom awakened among them a more widespread interest in their own history, and many of their traditions, up to that time still mainly oral, were collected and written down. The greater families were also concerned with events in the kingdom at large, with many of their members studied its ancient histories and legends. By the end of the first century of the Fourth Age, there were already to be found in the Shire several libraries that contained many historical books and records. The largest of these collections were probably at Undertowers, at Great Smiles, and at Brandyhall. This account of the end of the Third Age is drawn mainly from the Red Book of Westmarch. The most important source for the history of the War of the Ring was so called because it was long preserved at Undertowers, the home of the Fair Wardens of the West March. It was in origin Bilbo's private diary, which he took with him to Rivendell. Frodo brought it back to the Shire together with many loose leaves of notes, and during Shire reckoning 1420 to 21, he nearly filled its pages with his account of the war. But next to it, and preserved with it, probably in a single red case, with the three large volumes bound in red leather that Bilbo gave to him as a parting gift. To these four volumes there was added in Westmarch a fifth, containing commentaries, genealogies, and various other matter concerning the Hobbit members of the Fellowship. The original Red Book has not been preserved, but many copies were made, especially of the first volume, for the use of the descendants of the children of Master Samwise. Ooh. The most important copy, however, has a different history. It was kept at the Great Smiles, but it was written in Gondor, probably at the request of the great grandson of Peregrine, and completed in SR 1592. Its southern scribe appended this note: Findegale, King's writer, finished this work in IV 172. Is that the fourth age? Oh yeah, maybe it is. Maybe after they talked about the Shire rejoining the reunited kingdom after War of the Rings, maybe that's when they abandoned the Shire reckoning and started using the complete the, the whole the calendar of the United Kingdom. Not the not the our United Kingdom. It's just they're reunited, whatever it is that they call in the fourth age. So this is the 172nd year of fourth age. It's called IV 172. It is an exact copy in all details of the Thane's book in Minas Tirith. That book was a copy made at the request of King Alasar of the Red Book of the Perianath and was brought to him by the Thane Peregrine, when he retired to Gondor in IV 64. This is like, yeah. In case you're wondering, I'm not quite able to follow all of that. This is insane. The Thane's book was thus the first copy made of the Red Book and contained much that was later omitted or lost. In Minas Tirith, it received much annotation and many corrections, especially of names, words, and quotations in the Elvish languages, and there was added to it an abbreviated version of those parts of the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, which lie outside the account of the war. The full tale is stated to have been written by Barahir, grandson of the steward Faramir, sometime after the passing of the king. But the chief importance of I guess the king is Aragorn, shit. But the chief importance of Findegil's copy is that it alone contains the whole of Bilbo's translations from the Elvish. These three volumes were found to be a work of great skill and learning, in which between 1403 and 1418 he had used all the sources available to him in Rivendell, both living and written. But since they were little used by Frodo, being almost entirely concerned with the elder days, no more is said of them here. Since Meriadoc and the Peregrine became the heads of their great families and at the same time kept up their connections with Rohan and Gondor, the libraries at Bucklebury and Tuckborough contained much that did not appear in the Red Book. In Brandy Hall there were many works dealing with Eriador and the history of Rohan. Some of these were composed or begun by Meriadoc himself, though in the Shire he was chiefly remembered for his herb lore of the Shire, and for his reckoning of years in which he discussed the relation of the calendars of the Shire and Bree to those of Rivendell, Gondor, and Rohan. He also wrote a short treatise on old worlds and names in the Shire, showing special interest in discovering the kinship with the language of the Rohirrim, of such Shire words as Matham and old elements in place names. So Pepin became kind of a linguistics? That's unexpected. At Great Smiles, the books were of less interest to Shire folk, though more important for a larger history. None of them was written by Peregrine, but he and his successors collected many manuscripts written by scribes of Gondor, mainly copies of or summaries of histories or legends relating to Elendil and his heirs. Only here in the Shire were to be found extensive materials for the history of Numenor and the arising of Sauron. It was probably at Great Smiles that the Tale of Years was put together, with the assistance of material collected by Meriadoc. Though the dates given are often conjectural, especially for the Second Age, they deserve attention. It is probable that Meriadoc obtained assistance and information from Rivendell, which he visited more than once. There, though Elrond had departed, his sons long remained, together with some of the high elven folk. It is said that a Celeborn went to dwell there after the departure of Galadriel. Celeborn. Who's Celeborn? Is that her husband? But there is no record of the day when at last he saw the grey heaven. At last he saw the Grey Havens, and with him went the last living memory of the elder days in Middle Earth. And there we go. That was the prologue to the book. Actually, not just this book, it was the prologue of the entire Lord of the Rings. Because after this is book one. Well, it says book one. So I guess that means Fellowship of the Ring. I knew it wasn't like intended to be a history when it was written and that. Okay, that was a long prologue. I don't usually if it's any other book, honestly, and I see the prologue is that long, I would probably just skip the whole thing. Maybe I shouldn't. Prologue is usually more involved than this. I've read some books where the prologue is actually more like a first chapter. It's just not as long as usually. Sometimes it's a little bit far away from the main characters, from the main event, or maybe sometimes it sheds a little bit of light on what's to come. And this one is more like a thesis that's just pure background knowledge and a little bit of recap on what happened in the Hobbit. So all this is going to really help set the tone. I think set the tone of the world and like, what's going to happen. It actually contains quite a bit of spoiler content by today's standard, if you really think about it. Talking about how where these books come from, like Frodo wrote this, Sam wrote this, Mary wrote this, Pepin wrote this. Clearly, none of them died because they survived the journey to write books afterwards. But it is like I mentioned earlier. He gives this. He gives them the weight of history, which is quite unusual. He's talking about all of this like they actually happened. He's actually writing about a piece of history that's real that we have actually heard about. And yeah, I find that really well, really unusual, actually really charming. So next time when we come back, we are going to officially start the first book, and the first chapter is called "A Long Expected Party." Um, if I don't remember this exactly, but I think the first chapter of The Hobbit might have been the unexpected party. And if that is the case, that's a really cool callback. So thanks for watching, and I can't wait to actually begin the story because and yeah, this has been a bit of a information dump, but I'm still glad I read this, and I wouldn't like really blame you if you skipped that entirely and just went to the first chapter. That's probably what I would have done if I'm to be completely honest with myself. But it's still really nice to know all that stuff. I just really seriously doubt that I will be able to remember much of it. Anyway, that'll be the reading party for today. Thanks so much for joining me. And if you're watching this on YouTube, maybe consider subscribing to the channel, and that'll be a real help. And yeah, the entire reading of The Hobbit is on the channel, so check that out if you can. We'll be back very soon with the first chapter of The Hobbit. Until then, have a nice day. Oh, by the way, I'm recording this on December 29th of 2020. So this is a few days after Christmas, but a few days before New Year. I'm kind of stuck in the in between. So in that case, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and Happy New Year. And I'll see you next time.